So this is protecting information through a diverse supply chain. My name is Amanda Silver. I'm a senior manager with the Boeing Company. I work in our information security organization. I'm responsible for governance and supply chain cybersecurity. So half of my team is responsible for the policy and compliance of our internal network. The other half looks at our suppliers and their cybersecurity posture. I've been with Boeing for about 10 and a half years. I started in our defense space. I then moved to help build Boeing's insider threat program, and I've been with information security a little bit over a year now. So Boeing is a really big and diverse company, and with that comes the complexities of the supply chain. So if you multiply out the size of Boeing times the size of our suppliers and then go out and out and out, you've got an incredibly complicated network to deal with. What I want to focus on during this talk is how do you protect information in that complex and diverse of an environment when you're dealing with suppliers and the various regulations that come from both our US government partners as well as our partners around the world on both the commercial and foreign government side. So, Boeing, Dennis Muilenburg took over as the CEO of Boeing in 2014 or so, and around the time of the Boeing Centennial launched our new purpose and mission, which is to connect, protect, explore, and inspire the world through aerospace innovation, with the aspirational goal of being the best in aerospace and an enduring global industrial champion by 2025. So, to get there, we've made huge investments in our products and services. Our intellectual property is at the point of priceless and needs protection, right? So you don't become the best in aerospace and a global enduring industrial champion by just throwing away your hard-earned intellectual property and that of the companies that have helped you build it and support it. So we have a really close working relationships with a lot of our suppliers. It helps cultivate innovation to have that partnership mentality rather than you provide a part to us and go along your merry way, right? And it's really critical to success that we partner with our suppliers, but it also opens us up to a lot more risk than we would face if we kept everything internal. So it adds a little bit of the complexity to the environment. And the big key question that we have to ask, especially as cybersecurity professionals, is constantly is how do we manage that risk while still enabling the business? Because that's the underlying tenet that is going to make Boeing successful for another 100 years. If you're not aware, we hit our 100-year centennial in 2016, so one of the oldest, largest manufacturers in the United States. So a little bit on the Boeing business distribution. If you look at our stats from last year, we hit the $100 billion mark in revenue. That's the first time we've done that. About 60% of that business comes from our commercial airplanes sector. Last year we had about 23% straight defense. So that's going to be your airplane, your fighter jets, your helicopters, things like that. And then Boeing Global Services was started in 2017, I believe July 2017, so we're coming up our 2-year anniversary of that as an independent business unit. And they've grown to 17% of our profit and revenue since then. And that BGS is a mixture of both defense and commercial, and is really focused on aftermarket services. So how do we provide parts and support to our airplane customers after they've already purchased the airplane. Similar on the defense side. So we have around 153,000 employees in 65 countries, all 50 US states. We have customers in over 150 countries around the world, and we have suppliers in over 75 countries. To clarify, we have 85,000 tier 1 suppliers in 75 plus countries. So think about the scope of that problem set as you start to wrap your head around it. It's a little hard to see, I apologize, but these are all the countries where our suppliers reside. The blue dots are just the capitals of the country. It's not anything specific of location. But with that global distribution, you can really see how daunting it might be to try and secure that supply chain. And when we look at security, we focus on not just, my team focuses mostly on the cybersecurity, but we integrate really closely with our physical security partners as well, because we have to get, we're a major manufacturer. We operate with a just-in-time supply chain model, so we need the parts to arrive when they're needed. It costs a lot of money to store airplane parts, so we don't want them sitting in warehouses collecting dust. We only want them to arrive at our factories when they're needed on the line. So we started partnering with our security and fire protection organization that has our physical supply chain security team. Over the last year, they manage our relationship with the DHS program called the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. This helps expedite shipments through customs. There's similar programs in Canada, Europe, Australia as well. But it saves our company millions of dollars on customs fees and inspections every year. And last year, DHS levied new cyber requirements as part of CTPAT compliance. So we've been working with our physical supply chain security team to help them get the answers they need on the cyber side to adhere to that compliance for DHS. So if you look at the global distribution of our supply chain, assume it's about the same distribution, that's 60% commercial, 25-ish% defense, or I guess more like 70-30 if you break it up that way, but as our business. We have, both our commercial and defense business operates on a single network. So we have to operate with enterprise solutions that meet the needs of our entire customer base. That's challenging when you've got the US government levying regulations on you, you've got Europe levying regulations on you, you've got Asia Pacific countries levying regulations on you. So that whole managing risk and enabling the business becomes even more challenging when you look at the diversity of the supply chain. And we have to, in order to meet the requirements of our US defense customers specifically, we have to secure our commercial supply chain just as much as we secure the defense supply chain, or we've left the defense side open to risk. Because everything operates on the same network, it's one environment. So our suppliers on the commercial side have to be as secure as our defense suppliers. So that's the minimum level of entry right there for suppliers to work with Boeing, is basically the DFARS requirements. So I mentioned that suppliers are key to our vision, mission, aspiration of best in aerospace and global industrial champion. We really look at partnering to improve R&D, get more research and development done. Innovation is key, and we're not so naive to think that we're the only ones who can make products and services. There's people out there that do things better than we do. We can't specialize in everything. So using those suppliers to bring in innovation and help supplement the innovation that we're doing is really important to our success. And then one of the big key things is we're working to become a more global company. We're not pulling back and wanting to be more focused on the United States. We're actually striving to be more global. That gives us access to amazing amounts of smart people and great innovation. It also opens us up to more risk. So, our suppliers are critical in our role to being a global industrial champion, but we have to then accept that we're going to have to manage and mitigate more risk in that environment than we would if we pulled back our network and our confines to just operating within the United States. So if you look at cybersecurity in the supply chain, a couple of statistics from last year. About 60% of cyber attacks now involve a lateral move or a pivot. And that's where we've heard a lot this week about adversaries targeting small and mid-level suppliers who don't have the same maturity in their cybersecurity posture as the big primes like the Boeings and the Lockheeds. So the adversary gains access to that small supplier and then uses that trusted relationship to pivot and work its way up the supply chain to the companies that have the more valuable data. And that's how they infiltrate. About 50% of ransomware attacks target manufacturing operations. Boeing is one of the largest US-based manufacturers. Obviously, this is a concern for us. You might have seen in the news over the last year, I think it was around March, April of last year, that Boeing was hit by WannaCry. We actually like to call it the not WannaCry event because it wasn't actually WannaCry that hit us, and it was not as distributed as the Seattle Times would make it out to be. It hit, I don't know, a handful of computers in Charleston, South Carolina that hadn't been patched. The rest of our network was patched a year prior to mitigate that risk. We've been dealing with pulling in computing devices that are purchased by the business. We call it the non-IT space. They're not managed by the IT organization. We've been working on pulling them back in, and those were some that just hadn't gotten under our configuration management yet. So they got compromised by, I can't remember what the virus was. It was a slightly different one, but it wasn't WannaCry. Still a concern that we have to be aware of. 50% of cyber attacks are coming from nation states. Our nation state adversaries are more persistent, they're more powerful, they're more patient, they're going to take their time and test. We've been hearing all week about how China plays in the whole world, Russia plays in their sandbox is the entire world, Russia's is Ukraine, North Korea, Iran. It's a constant threat, and when a company like Boeing that builds a huge array of defense and commercial platforms that are very lucrative, we're a huge target, and we know that. I mean, you look at the C909, the COMAC, the Chinese commercial aircraft company, it looks suspiciously like the 737. China's got some other fighters, probably us, Lockheed, they got breached, right? So we know it's there, we know it's a threat. And then the big thing is supply chain attacks are increasing year over year. 70% increase between 2017 and 2018. Those small and mid-level suppliers are vulnerable, and that gives them, until they secure their networks, they're going to continue to be vulnerable and continue to, the adversary is going to continue to try and infiltrate them. So you look at the threat to the supply chain, and then there's threats to innovation or information, if you look at the information protection side of things. So you've got the cyber threat, you have the insider threat, and you have the physical threat. We've talked a lot about the cyber threat. We just went through some of the stats, a couple more. About 92% of malware is delivered via email. People still click on links. Training is a huge issue in every country, every company. You have to train your workforce not to fall for this phishing, but social engineering is good. They're good at their job. That's why it's there and why it's still successful. So it's a constant battle. About 56% of organizations have reported breaches caused by one of their suppliers. It's usually those small, mid-tier suppliers that then they gain access to. So yeah, cyber is a huge issue. We at Boeing, you might have read about Sue Bin, who targeted Boeing and several other large defense contractors. He was able to steal C-17 drawings, get them back to China and the PLA. It's been indicted at this point, but there is a cyber threat out there, and it's real, and we recognize that. Insider threat. So I always look at insider threat as kind of a mixture of cyber and physical, right? You've got people that make bad choices, are uninformed, and then you've got the people that are, and they maybe put some information on a thumb drive. That's kind of a mixture of cyber and physical, right? They're not really putting a back door in, but they're stealing information through technology. And then you've got the actual folks that maliciously do things like put in backdoors. That's more rare. So your unintentional insider is kind of the norm. They're the people that just don't have the training, don't have the awareness. They make dumb mistakes. But then there's the malicious insider. Those also exist. Having worked our insider threat program for 6+ years, I saw some really interesting cases. there's the people there's the technical ones, the ones that are trying to set themselves up so they can get back in, maybe get an adversary in or whatever from a networking perspective. There's folks that are out for personal gain. So they're leaving the company, they take information so they can start their own consulting firm and then sell that information back to Boeing or other big companies, or use that information that they worked on while they were with the company to market themselves as a consultant to come back. And then there's true espionage, which is always a problem and it's hard to detect, and those are the really scary ones. Boeing's had a couple of them as well. Greg Chung spied for China for 30 years. He gave China the space shuttle. They found 250,000 pieces of paper in his basement. Yeah.
When you say espionage, would that also include replacing information? Let's just say you have some sort of a widget on a plane that does something critical, and that information on the design is stolen and then replaced with either a backdoor or a flaw, something that can be activated later on. I know that sounds kind of like...
So I would consider that sabotage more than espionage. Espionage has to have a nation state driver to it to fall under the Economic Espionage Act. There has to be that nation state perspective to it. Okay. Replacing parts or changing code on a platform, while it might have a driver from a nation state, I would put that more in the sabotage realm of insider threat than I would in espionage. Yeah, I mean, we've had that issue too. I mean, we had a disgruntled, I mean, it wasn't the nation state thing, we had a disgruntled employee throw some washers into an engine in one of our planes in Philadelphia and destroyed it, right? But yeah, so Greg Chung, like I said, we've had our share of problems. Greg Chung had 250,000 pieces of paper in his basement when the FBI raided his house. 30 years working for Boeing, spying for China, sending them information as he could get hold of it. He wouldn't have been caught, but the FBI identified a different individual who then led them to Greg Chung. He was sentenced to 16 years for violation of the Espionage Act. It's the longest sentence that anyone's ever received. On the slightly funnier side, Greg Justice was an engineer down in El Segundo, and if you have the chance, look up the LA Times article. It reads like a Get Smart episode, kind of the bumbling spy. He thought he was selling secrets to the Russians. It was an undercover FBI agent. That was pretty fun, because we knew the information was safe. We kind of helped the FBI work that. So yeah, I mean, insider threat's real. And then the physical threat, you've got laptop theft, improper access. Those are kind of the key things that you worry about there. We have campuses where you've got foreign nationals working on the same campus where export controlled information is worked on, or export controlled programs are. So without proper signage, proper training, proper understanding, badge readers, we have access control badges that get us into rooms, things like that. But an employee gets lazy, they leave information lying around, they don't secure it appropriately, they leave their laptop in their car gets broken into, and now they've saved all sorts of stuff to their desktop rather than putting on a file share within the network. These are all these are the three big threats to information and to innovation, kind of buckets of them. And you could apply all of these to suppliers as well, especially if you've got suppliers with direct access to your facilities or your network. So we've got, there's a range of suppliers, right? There's folks that are on site with you working side by side every day. There's suppliers you never see that just send parts. So it kind of depends on what the range is there. I still think that the biggest threat from the supply chain to a company like Boeing is the cyber threat, and that small mid-tier supplier who doesn't have tight cybersecurity and they get hacked. I'm much less concerned about an insider threat or a physical threat from a supplier than I am that cyber threat. So how do you protect information and secure your supply chain when you're operating in this kind of complex and diverse environment? I'll be the first to say there's no silver bullet, right? There's no one thing you can do to fix the problem. And I think that's something that you'll hear every big company, every company, period, say they're struggling with, is how do you, here we've heard a lot about DFARS and the flow of CUI, CDI through the supply chain. How do you ensure that it's secure? You can't. You can mitigate the risk. That's the thing you have to focus on. To have any sort of chance of success, you have to have it has to be an integrated approach. You can't just focus on cyber, just focus on physical controls. You have to bring all of the different threat vectors together. You have to understand that a supplier's financial performance, or they got acquired. Who acquired them? Was it a Chinese-owned company? Oh, that's interesting. Having those all that awareness in the big picture of things is important. So you might have a team that does specifically cyber, a team that does specifically physical security, things like that, but you've got to bring it all together into one place to be able to see it. It's hard to achieve in a diverse environment, but it's doable. Having a consistent approach for a company like Boeing, where we really do have to approach it at an enterprise level, means nobody's ever happy with how you do it. Our commercial business thinks we're too restrictive and that we inhibit business by our cybersecurity policies. Our defense business thinks we're not restrictive enough and we're not helping with their business because we're not going above and beyond the contractual requirements we have from the government. So you have to make that 80 to 90% solution and go from there. So the big things you need to do are focus on managing and monitoring risk. I think I've said that multiple times today already. Have effective contractual controls. Work in a collaborative procurement environment. And then have vigilant governance and compliance requirements. So when I talk about managing and monitoring risk, you have to be flexible and encourage collaboration with your suppliers. It's better to have that positive working relationship with your supply chain teams so that you're working together towards a common end goal. You can't just going in and just dictating to them, it works because they have to contractually abide, but it's better to have foster that relationship that you both want to manage and monitor the risk. You also need to really focus on determining what controls are required based on the level of access that supplier has. So are you talking about a janitorial service who has no network access? It doesn't touch data, unless they happen to stumble across a piece of data laying on a desk. They don't have access to data. You're not going to put the same cybersecurity requirements on that contract as you are on a company that is managing your mainframe or your cloud environment, right? Like totally different environments. And it's a cost savings too, or cost benefits analysis. I'm not gonna spend the money to secure a janitor like I'm gonna spend the money to secure the folks running my mainframe. Having consistent risk monitoring and assessing and analyzing the risk also helps you provide good intel for your senior leaders to make smart sourcing decisions. So if you've got that risk posture and you can project the overall risk picture of a supplier and say, hey, I know this is a long-time supplier, but they just got bought by XYZ company, and we really question where they come, their background and their funding and their motives. We might want to start looking for some other options, things like that. So effective contractual controls is another big one. You really want to make sure that your supply chain organization, so your procurement agents, your supply chain risk folks, those people working directly with the suppliers for contracts and procurement and things like that, understand that cybersecurity requirements need to be one of the first things that they consider when they're putting the contract together. It's not a sign of distrust or a lack of confidence in your suppliers to have those requirements in your contracts. It just gives you more flexibility to say, hey, it's a contractual obligation that you provide me with a third-party audit or that you let me perform an assessment on you. And that helps you secure your data. We work pretty much every contract. My team does a lot of contract negotiations. Some suppliers will accept our terms and condition, our terms of use for our cybersecurity requirements without a single comment. Others want to negotiate every single line item. So it raises a red flag to me when they don't want to accept our cybersecurity controls. I'll say that for sure. But we work through it, and we usually come to an agreement that's we pull in legal and the Global Privacy Office and other places like that as necessary to make sure that we're making smart decisions for the Boeing company. The things that we try to include in our contracts that really help us are the right to conduct assessments, code scan. So if they're providing code, that they have to do secure code scanning on it before they send it to us. The request of third party, so they have a Deloitte or an Ernst & Young or whoever come in and assess them, that we have right to ask for those results. Breach notification, so it's an obligation in the DFARS slowdown clause that they have to notify us of breaches, but having that in general in our contracts is a really good way to know, well, okay, your supplier just got breached. Do we have data? Like, then you can start doing your risk mitigation, right? You can say, oh, what data do they have? What do we need to be concerned about? Do we need to change our contract requirements because they just got breached? So all those sort of things. And then things like notifying you if they were acquired, that whole conversation going back to were they bought by a Chinese company? And things like work location changes too. So is my supplier that accesses my network on a daily basis but they're not on site, they work from home, and now they're moving to China. I don't want them doing that the same way that they did it. I'm probably gonna terminate that connection before I allow it to continue. So knowing when they change work locations too is really important. And then regularly reviewing existing contracts. A lot of contracts are signed for 5, 10, 15, 20, never expiring. We call those evergreen contracts. Obviously, the cybersecurity environment changes a lot faster. So even if you've got a 5-year contract, think about where we were 5 years ago and where we are today. So even if you had cybersecurity requirements in that contract you signed 5 years ago, they're probably null and void at this point because the technology has moved so fast and changed so much. So taking the time to, whatever opportunity you have to review contracts and update those cybersecurity terms is really helpful in mitigating risk and protecting information. When we talk about collaborative procurement, when you walk into a procurement team as the cybersecurity professional, you're the only one worried about cybersecurity. Everybody else has their own bailiwick that they're worried about, making sure is included in the RFP or the contract or whatever. But it's your job as that cybersecurity professional to educate the rest of the group of why that has to be the foundation. I think we've heard today or this week about the government starting to look at security and cybersecurity as being, if you don't have it, it's a non-starter. Like the 3 pillars of procurement, the cost, performance, and schedule. Security is the foundation of those now, and so it's your job as a cybersecurity professional to educate the rest of the procurement team on what the importance of these requirements, and helping them understand that getting them in early is the best way to ensure that they're included and that they're consistent across contracts. The other thing here is to really make sure that you understand the statement of work that's being proposed and the use case. So what do the data flows look like? Is the supplier going to be hosting data externally? Are they going to be located on site? Are they using their own machines? Are they using your machines? What does that environment look like? What information do they need access to execute on the statement of work you're paying them for? Do they need access to your crown jewels to get the job done, or do they just need very basic, general administrative data? There's a different, that goes back to the risk question, right? Sensitivity of data it's really important that you know that up front, though. I can't tell you how many times I have people come to me and say, well, I have this supplier working for me, or this contractor working for me, and I now need him to have full unmitigated access to the network to do his job. I'm like, was this included in the original statement of work? Well, no, the scope changed, but there's nothing else we can have him do. I'm like, update the contract, then come back and talk to me. So, it just really helps when people understand that having that really well laid out expectations will help protect the company and protect both the supplier and the person or the company that they're working for. It helps, kind of inadvertently putting information at risk. And then vigilant governance and compliance. So I look at this as the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. So as I said in the contract controls, you should have the right to assess your suppliers. They should be contractually obligated to cooperate in that environment. But if you look at it at their compliance, you have to regularly check that. So the plan is kind of back to what we were talking about, having those strong cybersecurity requirements built into your contracts and built into your RFPs. The doing is the execution from the supplier. If the supplier signs up to the agreement, they should be expected that they're going to execute on those requirements. The checking allows you to come in, do those assessments, see if they are or not compliant to your contract requirements. And that allows you to take action before there's a major breach or you lose information or something terrible happens because you didn't ever look at that supplier again. So you kind of putting these four big categories together really helps bring together a solid information protection and supply chain security program. There's a ton of other things you can do, but like operating within resources, managing risk, these are kind of basic things that you can pretty easily implement. So there's multiple reasons to protect information throughout the supply chain. We've talked about it secures your innovation. You have to be cutting edge to compete in today's world. It doesn't matter if it's commercial, defense, whatever. There's so much competition out there that if you're not on the leading edge of technology, you're gonna fail. And you don't become a 100-plus-year-old company by failing. So, it's something that we really take protecting our information and our innovation seriously. I work closely on a regular, daily basis with our intellectual property management office. I work with our export control team to make sure we've got those proper controls in place. And securing stuff for ourselves, we just, it flows down to the suppliers. So they have those same expectations built in. There's more regulatory requirements today than ever before. We've talked about DFARS ad nauseum this week. But then there's also things like GDPR. We're a global company. We have employees in Europe. We are required to adhere to the GDPR law. It's a 5% fine, 5% of your annual profits as a fine if you don't execute properly on GDPR. That's $5 billion for Boeing. That's a lot of money. So we don't want to screw up there. And then jurisdictional export requirements. So again, we're not just a US-based company. We don't just have EAR and ITAR that we have to deal with. We have to look at what are the export and import requirements for data that's originated in Australia or England or insert any other country here. Makes it really complicated. On just the US side for export violations, it's $1 million per violation. And then you try to clean that up, it becomes even more money. So I mean, it's pricey to not adhere to regulatory requirements. The environment is getting more complex. Companies are looking more and more to external hosting and infrastructure as a service, the cloud environment, to cut costs and be more competitive. We recently identified a supplier who wants to take our data and they're wanting to set up an infrastructure as a service with IBM. So normally in that environment, we would assess IBM as an external hosting option for our data, but we don't have the contract with IBM. So how do we flow that down to our supplier that they have to then assess their supplier of their infrastructure as a service to ensure that we have the proper confidence that they're protecting our information and our customers' information. You have to collaborate. With the environment as complex, like Boeing can't be the expert in everything. We need our suppliers to be the specialist that creates this amazing widget that comes together and builds this amazing project or product. We can't do everything. And then just, the bottom line, I think we've heard a million times this week is adversaries are targeting our supply chain. So if you want to make sure your information is secure and protected, you have to focus. You can't just look internally anymore. You have to look down the tiers of the supply chain and figure out how to build up those suppliers that don't have the same cybersecurity maturity levels that you would expect from your own company. And if anybody's got any questions, I think that's it.